I grew up probably, it would be safe to say, in Illinois. My dad was in the military, in the Air Force, and so we traveled around a lot based upon his assignments. And Central Illinois was where we stayed the longest. And I graduated from high school there. And since we were in Illinois, I was thinking, well, where am I going to go to college? And Southern Illinois University popped up. So I was accepted to SIU, and I thought I wanted to be an architect early on, until I got into the specifics of being an architect, which involved a lot of math. And you cannot use SACKETT and math in the same sentence. So I was looking around for something else, and coincidentally, the school newspaper at SIU had a little tiny ad in the back of the paper on one of their editions saying that the school-operated radio and television station wanted announcers and engineers. And I was still a freshman, and this was about 6 months after I had started school, and that piqued my interest. So I went by the radio station, which happened to be in an old World War II barracks on campus, and I walked in there, and 10 minutes later I changed my major, and I never looked back. And 4 years later, I was graduating with guys and girls who had no earthly idea what they wanted to do. And I did. So that's what I did, and went to Washington, D.C., where my parents lived, and got married in 1967, and went to work for a television station in Washington. Didn't have a newsroom or anything. And then I got in the military. Uncle Sam wanted to draft me. So I said, well, I've seen how officers live, which my dad was, and I've seen how enlisted people live. And I said, well, if I'm going to have to go in the military, I'll go in as an officer. So I did, and became an infantry second lieutenant. And during those 7 years that I was in the military, we had a boy, Mick, and a girl, Elizabeth. And I was still keeping my hand in broadcasting. I had a radio show once a month on Armed Forces Radio in Munich, and that was a lot of fun. But I was also a speechwriter for a commanding general for a division, the 3rd Infantry Division, and got stationed in Germany and Indianapolis and a few other places too. And then I got out, and I said, well, what am I going to do? And so I started sending tapes out and everything, and I sent a tape to Bangor, Maine, and the news director at the CBS affiliate hired me, and that was in 1976. And so I stayed in the business for the next, almost 45 years, I guess. But then my in-laws were natives of Chicago, as my wife is. And he retired and moved to Florida, to Melbourne. And this was in the mid-70s. And we came down for a visit with the kids, and never been to Florida before. And so we stayed a couple of weeks. And I go back to Bangor, and I said, hey, Florida's not all that bad, because then I went back to a snowstorm, 35-degree weather, the whole 9 yards. And so as a consequence, in 1977, I started sending tapes out to stations in South Florida. And I tell the story that Channel 12 had the first right of refusal because they were the first ones that I sent a tape to, and they wrote a very nice letter back to me and said, well, we like your work, but we think you need more seasoning. So I said, okay. So a couple of weeks later, I get a letter from the news director at Channel 5, and he says, can you come down for an interview? So I flew down in January of 1978. And it was ironically, it was one of those winters in South Florida where we have like 25, 27, 30-degree weather for about a week and a half. I came down. Didn't bring any. I said, Florida. Why bring any winter clothes? So it was freezing. It was unbearably cold. So I spent some time with my in-laws and came down for the interview. And before I left, the news director said, "Do you want to come to work for us?" And so I said, "Yes, I do." And so went back to Maine, and in February of 1978, we sold our house in Bangor, put everybody in the car, all our stuff, and moved to Florida. And February 24th, why I remember this date, I don't know. February 24th, 1978, that was my first day at WPTV Channel 5. And the rest is history. I stayed there for 34 years, and it was just an absolute delight. There was a time early on when I would want to go work the night shift, go home, sleep, get up so I can come back to work. I mean, it was that much fun. Well, in 1978, when I came down, I had no idea that Wellington even existed. Go back to Bangor, and we came down, and my in-laws found us a place at Kirk and Forest Hill, an apartment. And so we were there for a year, and then we looked around and we found a house on Andrews Road, which was right under the flight path at Palm Beach International Airport. Why we bought there, I can't remember now. But we were there for 5 years. Now, my news director at the time lived in Wellington early on. And so a couple of times, few times, a half dozen times, my wife and I came out here for dinner or some events that he invited us to. And so we got a kind of a flavor of Wellington. That was our first exposure to Wellington. And so after 5 years in West Palm Beach, we said, we need to build a house. We need to move somewhere, set down roots. And the first place that popped into our mind was Wellington. So in 1983, 84, we built a house in Wellington, and I think we were the third or the fourth house on the street when we moved in. And we have now been in the same house for 40 years. 40 years. But that was the first exposure that I had to Wellington, and to this day, to this moment, I have no regrets whatsoever. Wellington, early on when we came down here, was very, I guess, traditionally when you call something in the early, it was a sleepy village. It wasn't even a village at that time. It was just a sleepy area, a lot of unbuilt up areas. State Road 7 was 2-lane, Forest Hill Boulevard was 2-lane, Southern Boulevard was 2-lane. And this was well before, when we moved in, it was well before GPSs, and it was very easy to get lost in what would become Wellington. We were here when they built the 2 hospitals. We were here when they built the mall. It was just very, very easy lifestyle that we were involved with. And my kids, my son was at an age where he graduated from Forest Hill High School because there wasn't a high school out here. My daughter went to Crestwood Middle because there wasn't a middle school out here. She was in the first graduating class at Wellington High School. The first year, while they were still building it, they transported them to what was north. It was up in the north end. There was a high school up there, North Side or North Shore High School, I think it was. That's where she went the first year, and then she was the first graduating class here. But it was just very lazy. We had nice little restaurants. We joined St. Rita Catholic Church early on. So it was just a very, very relaxed lifestyle, and we thoroughly enjoyed it, and we still enjoy it today. The activities for the kids, there wasn't a whole lot organized events and sports for the kids. Not that it mattered to my son or daughter, because my son really didn't get into sports. He was more cerebral. My daughter was more into singing and drama at the high school. And so they really didn't get involved with that. And I really don't remember anything about, sports back in those days. Not like it is today. I mean, Wellington today is just really a great place for youngsters to grow up, especially those that love sports. I envy them. Softball was and continues to be one of my passions. We started at Softball League, a senior softball league in Wellington in the, I want to say the early 80s or the mid 80s or whatever. And it just kept growing and growing and growing. And Wellington today is a hot spot for softball. Wellington and Royal Palm Beach. As a matter of fact, the station, in observing my 25th anniversary at WPTV, knew how much I loved softball. So apparently the news director, or the general manager at the time, got together with the representatives here in Wellington and had one of the softball fields at Pearson Park named after me. So if you go to Pearson Park and you go to the softball complex out there, which is gorgeous, you'll see my name up on one of the fields. So that touches my heart. Memorable stories. There are a lot. One of the most memorable was I had an opportunity to go to Russia in 1991 when communism fell. And for whatever reason, our news director and the general manager said, "I think we're going to send you to Russia." And so we spent I had a photographer who ironically lives in Wellington, and a producer, and myself, and we went to Moscow and spent a week there, and then we went to Kiev in the Ukraine and spent a week with a family there. So that was very, very, very memorable. As far as local stories, and particularly pertaining to Wellington, or near Wellington, was when Southern Boulevard was still a two-lane highway. We got word that a small plane, like a Cessna, had used Southern Boulevard as a landing strip because he had an emergency. And so I went out there with a camera, I remember it, and did a story, talked to the pilot, and that kind of thing. And he landed it perfectly, and then they, after finding out that there was a mechanical problem, they towed it away. The other story was, and I don't know how many people remember, that Wellington had a Blockbuster, and it was situated where BurgerFi is right now, right there by Starbucks. And I had gotten to work, or I was getting ready to go to work, and I got in the car, and the phone rings, and the station says, "Hey, there's a hostage situation at the Blockbuster in Wellington. Can you go cover it?" So I said, "Sure," So I didn't have a camera person. So I drove there, and I parked there where the Ultimate Gym used to be, right there. And sure enough, there was a guy inside who was trying to rob it. Didn't get that far, so he took some hostages. And he's inside the Blockbuster. So there was a gentleman there. I'll never forget. There was a gentleman there who had a camera, a whole video camera. And it was exactly like the one I had at home. So I'm hiding behind these trees. And there's a Blockbuster, and I'm behind these trees. And so I see this guy with the camera that I knew how to operate. So I go over to him, I says, can I use your camera? I'm with Channel 5. There's a guy in there. He says, yeah. He says, I'll give you $50 if you let me use it. And he said, okay. So he gives me the camera, and I start shooting, on the outside. And after half an hour, or whatever, the guy comes out. The sheriff's deputies handcuff him and they walk him out. And I'm trying to shoot and ask him questions at the same time. Why did you do it? Why did you do it? Who are you? That kind of thing. And what I shot was edited and put on the air. And they still kid me. They still kidded me about doing that in Wellington. But that I remember. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, broadcasting back in those days was just absolute fun. Not like today. Not like today, unfortunately. Well, right now I'm involved in the Wellington Community Foundation. Our mission, and has been for about the past, I think we've been in existence for about 7 years, is Wellington is the footprint for what we do. And what we do is we help seniors, we help veterans, and we help children. And that is our mission. And I've been involved with that for about 4 or 5 years now, I think, right after it started. Organizations, I was with, not in Wellington, but I was on the board of Friends of Foster Children for about 12 years. And I am also on the board and the president of a nonprofit down in Boynton. It's called Women's Circle, and it helps women, especially those who come from Haiti or countries like that come into Palm Beach County that have no skills. And so we tutor them in computers, in the English language, and eventually to mentor them to become U.S. citizens. So that still keeps me busy even after being retired from Channel 5 for about 12 years. So and I still play softball. I was honored when the representatives from the Historical Society here in Wellington asked me to do this project with them and for them. And I think that it is just absolutely vital that Wellington, in its current form, needs to have some history. And there have been any number of people who we have interviewed who were here at the, quote, beginning of what would become the village of Wellington. And we get their thoughts on the early days, what Wellington was like. Did you envision what it is today? And it is just remarkable, some of the things that I have learned about the village, even living here for 40 years. There have been nuggets of information that people have brought up, and I say, is that true? Really? Did not know that. So I feel very honored to be able to be part of it, and hopefully, people will view these interviews and learn about the history of Wellington. It's just not a village. It has history. My vision of Wellington, I think, has been right on track. As I said earlier, it was just a lot of land and few people, no schools, this couple of stores, that kind of thing. And gradually it just grew and grew and grew right in front of our eyes. And I have to compliment the village councils who saw what needed to be done, and they did a very good job in not just wholeheartedly saying, okay, let's do this, but they did it in a very, very specific manner. And I think that went a long way into what Wellington has developed today. People know Wellington. I mean, there was a time when, as we all recall, it was upscale living, and it still is that to a certain degree. We have the equestrian community, which has been a vital part of Wellington's growth. And but to answer your basic question, I think that Wellington, in my opinion, developed in a great way, and I think the people who live here now just absolutely love it. Some of my fondest memories for Wellington, in living here for 40 years, I think number one is the family. My wife Paula and the kids grew up here. My son still lives in Royal Palm Beach. My daughter lives in New York. That probably is the number one. That we raised them and they had a good environment. At least I hope they did. Anyway, and meeting people. I think that's probably number two. The people who live here that I've had an opportunity to meet over the years has been just tremendous, just tremendous. When I was in the Army, I was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, which is just south of Seattle. When we were there for 2 years, I think, we fell in love with the Seattle area. I mean, it was just absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. So when I got out of the military and I started looking around, I kept sending tapes to the stations in Seattle. And it was a time in the late 70s, early 80s that the television news business was, positions were kind of stagnant. Nobody was leaving, nobody was coming in, nobody was being hired. So in the interim, as I say, I started sending tapes to Florida. And so I got the job at Channel 5. And I will admit that after I was hired, for the first 5 years, I was sending tapes to Seattle, Washington, trying to get a job there because we just loved it so much. But the more, still, nobody was leaving. So the more I stayed at Channel 5, the more entrenched I became. And the more I fell in love with West Palm Beach, the station, the people, and I got to a point, at a certain point in time, saying, why go anywhere else? So that's why I stayed at Channel 5 for 34, because I just fell in love with it.